On a trip to South Florida a couple years ago, my husband and I fell in love with the little Cuban restaurant and especially their empanadas. So today we're going to make the Mum's Brown dinner version of beef empanadas. For today's recipe, you'll need 1/4 of a large onion chopped, 1 clove of garlic minced, 1 pound of hamburger meat, 2 tablespoons of chili powder, a 1/2 teaspoon of cumin, a 1/2 teaspoon of oregano, a 1/2 teaspoon ancho chili powder, 1 teaspoon lime juice, a 1/2 cup of chicken stock, and salt to taste. For the pastry crust, you'll need 4 tablespoons of butter cut into chunks, and that will need to be cold, 3 cups all-purpose flour, a 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 2 eggs, and a 1/2 to a cup of cold water. For the green empanada sauce, you'll need a 1/2 of a bunch of fresh parsley, and you're going to do a rough chop on that, 1/8 to a 1/4 cup of water, 1/4 of a large onion chopped, 1 clove of garlic crushed, a 1/4 cup of white vinegar, a pinch of salt, a pinch of sugar, and a 1/2 cup of real mayonnaise. We're going to start with our filling first with our hamburger meat, and we have just a few simple ingredients that we're going to be putting together so that we can make this delicious filling. However, if you do not have time to cook from scratch, there are pre-made taco seasonings that you can use. And we're going to start with the large onion. I only need about 1/4 of this, and I'm going to be using it to flavor my meat, so I'm just going to cut this into quarters, and I'm just going to chop this up a little bit. I don't need tiny pieces because I am going to be cutting this to go in to flavor my meat, so I just want to get it small enough that it will fry up nice. Next, I'm going to take my clove of garlic and give it a good whack. I'm going to get that papery shell off the outside. And I want to mince this, which means I want to cut it into finer pieces. So I'm going to make just several slices down through my garlic and then turn it and chop it into smaller pieces. And a good way to make sure that you have this minced is once you finish cutting through, turn your blade and go back through your pile again. Okay, so now I'm going to take my onions and I'm going to put them into a nice hot skillet and let those start sizzling, and I'm going to crumble in my hamburger meat. Now the recipe calls for 1 pound. I'm using about 1.25 pounds, but I'm just going to crumble it in here and I'm just going to brown it like I would for any recipe. And you'll just want to keep kind of stirring it around. You want it to brown, but you don't want it to scorch or burn. So just kind of keep turning it over as you're cooking. That will also incorporate your onions into your meat. My meat has been cooking for a little while and it's nice and browned, and I'm going to drain off the excess fat. Now, after you drain the meat, you want to make sure that you wipe out the skillet. This meat is going to be going inside a pastry, so you don't want it to be soggy or greasy. So wipe out that extra fat. Leave the onion bits though. I'm going to add my meat back to the skillet and adjust my heat to medium-low. And we're going to go ahead and get this meat seasoned. And we're going to be using our chili powder. This is cumin, oregano, ancho powder, and black pepper. Next, I'm going to add in my minced garlic. And I'm just going to take my spatula and just give this a good stir. I want it to be kind of spread out throughout my meat. Next, we're going to add in the lime juice and the chicken stock. And I'm going to mix this in real well. You'll start to see a beautiful dark color. And I'm going to let this simmer for about 10 minutes on low. While my meat is simmering, I'm going to get started with my pastry. And when you're using flour and you're measuring in a big measuring cup, you just want to scoop it, tap it down so it fills in all those air bubbles underneath, and level it off. This is not one of those times you want a heaping cup full of flour, but I do want to make sure I get a full cup of flour. Now this is a very simple dough. I only have a few ingredients, and I do have real butter. It is cold, but I've cut it into chunks because I'm going to be cutting this into my flour. And I have salt, and I'm just going to sprinkle that in. Now I'm using a pastry cutter to get this incorporated, and I'm just going to rock it back and forth. You can do this with a large fork. It's just going to take a little time, and just be patient. You want to touch it as little with your hands as you can because the butter will melt. And you just want to cut this in until you don't see any large globs of butter anymore. And then I'm going to take my egg. And I like to mix by hand because I like to see and feel if my ingredients are being incorporated. But again, very light touch. You don't want to hold it in your hand and melt the butter. And then I'm going to start adding in cold water, not a whole lot at a time, just a little bit at a time. And notice that I'm going to be kind of tossing this around. Again, not really smushing it, just trying to get the water distributed. And I want to continue to add water until I get kind of a crumbly ball. I want it to hold together, but I don't want it to be individual pieces anymore. And this is coming together nicely now. I'm able to ball it up, and I just want to get all those little crumbles that are down in the bottom. And once I can form this into a nice ball, I'll be ready to roll it out, and we can cut out our empanadas. Now I'm ready to roll this out, and I'm going to be using a rolling pin, and you want to make sure that you add a little flour so it doesn't stick. Now I'm rolling it out today on a piece of parchment paper, even though I have a nice big butcher block. It makes it a little bit easier to be able to pick these very thin circles up once I cut them. So you just want to continue to roll. Now this is a stiff dough, so you want to make sure that you keep flouring your rolling pin so that it does not stick. And I'm just going to roll this as thin as I can. Okay, now that I've gotten this dough pretty thin, I'm going to go ahead and start cutting out my circles. And you want to make sure that it's nice and thin. If it's too thick, just go ahead and just roll it out a little bit more. But what I'm going to use to cut this is actually a metal tumbler. It just seems to be the right size. When we were at the restaurant in Florida, we had large empanadas, which were almost a whole meal. We like ours more appetizer size. And I'm just going to cut these out, and I'm going to lay them on a cutting board that has some flour on there so that it's not going to stick. And once I get all of these cut, then I'll be ready to fill them. Now you're going to have lots of dough left where you couldn't cut out a circle. Just turn it back into a ball, roll it out again, and continue to cut more empanadas. Now before you stuff your empanadas, you want to check your filling. You want this to be a fairly dry mixture, so just go ahead and take a look at it. If there's a lot of extra liquid in the bottom, just take the lid off and let it simmer for a couple minutes. But you also want to taste, and this is the point where you need to decide, do I need to add salt? And for me, I think we need just a couple pinches, but you know your family's taste. But I'm just going to put that in, give it a good stir, and as soon as this reduces just a tiny bit, we're ready to fill. To fill an empanada, like I said, I want to make more of an appetizer size. I'm just going to take my disc and just stretch it just a little bit. I don't want to cause a hole. I've got my meat that is ready to go, and I'm just going to take a small spoonful, put it right in the middle. If you get too much, it is going to poke out the edges. And I'm just going to pull up the sides, and I'm going to give them a good pinch. Now, if they don't want to stick together, you can always moisten it with water or with egg wash, but I'm just going to kind of crimp the edges and lay them on my baking sheet. I have a tray full of empanadas, and I've taken my other egg with a little bit of water and just kind of mixed it together. I'm just making an egg wash, and I'm going to brush this over the top of the empanadas. This is going to give it a very shiny golden brown crust, and it's absolutely wonderful. Just give it a good coating, and then these will be ready to go in the oven and bake. These are going to go in a 400-degree oven for 20 to 30 minutes, and while they're cooking, I'll work on stuffing the rest of my dough. You just want to bake these till the tops are crispy and golden brown. These took about 28 minutes. Today I'm going to be making a green sauce, and I'm going to be using just a few ingredients, and I'm going to be using a half a package of fresh parsley. Just going to kind of divide it in half along with my other fresh ingredients. Let's mix this up. I'm going to be using the blender today, so I'm going to be cutting this into rough pieces. I don't have to have super duper fine, but with my bell pepper, if you remember to cut on the inside, it's not as likely to kind of slip out of your grip. And I'm just going to cut some big chunks because, like I said, I am going to be putting these into my blender. So green bell pepper first. Then my onion. Again, I don't need tiny pieces because I'm putting this in the blender, just enough to kind of make it easy to whoosh around. And then I have my parsley, and you want to just take this and give it a rough chop so it doesn't take as long to blend. So just fold it over and just give it a quick run through. Now you'll also want to add a crushed clove of garlic, and these fresh ingredients are going to make a delicious sauce. So I'm going to put that in there. Next, I'm going to add a half cup of real mayonnaise, a quarter cup of white vinegar, a pinch of salt, a pinch of granulated sugar, and about an 1/8 to 1/4 cup of water. I don't want this to be too runny. And then I'm going to blend it up. Once this is all blended, I'm just going to take it and pour it in a bowl, or actually today I'm using a mason jar, and I'm going to refrigerate this until I'm ready to serve my empanadas. It will thicken slightly while it's in the fridge. These empanadas are wonderful as an appetizer or even as a full meal, and you can serve them at room temperature or warmed up. These empanadas are also very delicious if you happen to dip them in queso sauce. The hardest part is not eating them all before it's time to serve. If you like today's recipe and you'd like them to continue, be sure to like, comment, and share. Thanks, guys.